Good morning, everybody. Thank you for listening in on talk this morning. I'm going to discuss the Humboldt Bay Living Shoreline project. It is a multi-benefit project that's currently in the planning phase, and it is intended to restore natural processes along a vulnerable shoreline of Humboldt Bay, along the corridor that Lorna and Hank just spoke a little bit about. I'd like to acknowledge our abstract co-authors, Hank Seaman, Connor Shea, Jeff Anderson, and Brett Vivian, also technical leads on the project. I'm going to briefly cover the project goals and the development of the project, the outcome of several site assessments and key findings from those, and then how those assessments have helped us inform the various alternatives that we've analyzed and the selected alternative, and then next steps. The project dates back to a study that Caltrans commissioned in 2004 of the corridor between Arcata and Eureka, which identified the sea level rise vulnerability, which then led to a more detailed flood risk and erosion risk analysis that you saw some graphics on some of the previous presentations here in blue to really better identify what the sea level rise risks would be and different project opportunities. This study was commissioned by Humboldt County Public Works, and within it, it identified the most vulnerable section of the corridor here in red between Bray Cut and Brainerd, and looked at a variety of different solutions through there. So the findings from those studies were culminated within the natural shoreline infrastructure study here in red. And I'll be focusing much of my discussion on the outcome of that study, which is now leading to the broader Humboldt Bay Living Shoreline project, which is getting kicked off here in the next phase this year and into 2025. So I want to start off by just acknowledging some key contributors shown up here in the top left: Hank and Connor, Jeff, my colleague Brett Vivian, and then SHN, Integral, and Jerry Rohde all contributed to this last phase. We also had a really robust technical working group, and many of you are in the room, or many folks that were on the working group are in the room this morning, and really want to express my appreciation for their contributions in helping guide the various assessments and providing a sounding board and providing feedback as the studies were done. And one of those individuals was Julia Elkin, who I think we all deeply miss and appreciate all of her contributions, obviously, over the years, and her memory will continue on in projects just like this. So the fundamental concept of this project is to integrate the natural flood risk reduction properties of the salt marsh along the shoreline between Brainerd and Bray Cut, in an area where historically the salt marsh was abundant and currently today is just present in isolated patches. So the overall goal is to enhance the intertidal coastal marsh habitat, protect transportation infrastructure, and create opportunities for innovation and learning. So as we teed up the studies, we really wanted to answer some key questions in working with the working group. What are the key physical drivers in anthropogenic interventions and that influence the physical processes along the eastern shoreline of the bay? Which drivers and processes have attributed to the loss or the gain of salt marsh within the project area, as shown here in the top right, a graphic that Hank had also shown earlier where salt marsh is present and there's a lack of erosion along the corridor. Where it's absent, we see obviously the erosion. And then the third and final question is, based on these drivers and processes, what potential natural shoreline infrastructure or nature-based solutions would be appropriate for the shoreline? And so we conducted a variety of studies, and I'll go through those key findings right now. The map on the left here shows the blue line, which is the 1870 historic marsh edge prior to any development. In 1895, much of Humboldt Bay, the marsh edge was diked, and you can see the remnant of that diking effort here, and then over time that quickly eroded. In brown is the 1870 marsh edge, and then today's marsh is shown in green, and then a couple of years in between. So obviously a lot of recession had occurred between 1870 and current. That marsh edge recession is far greater at rate than the marshes to the north in Jacoby Creek Marsh, as well as the Eureka Slough Marsh to the south. We worked closely with Jeff Anderson with his hydrodynamic model. He really helped us understand the effects that wind waves have on the tidal currents, and what's shown here with no wind on the top right during a 2-year ebb tide versus a 22-mile-an-hour northwest wind on the bottom right, resulting in higher velocities and higher shear stresses along shore in the southward direction. And that was corroborated with the evidence we saw on site with the depositional patterns of the gravel from the eroded rail prism shown here on the bottom. We assessed a variety of alternatives, all of which included a range of sizes of salt marsh within the project area and different types of shoreline concepts. And we qualitatively went through a screening criteria with the working group as well as other project partners, and looked at constructability, permitting, cost, and a variety of other criteria to help make an informed decision in terms of the alternative that was selected, which was indeed the restored salt marsh and within the footprint of the existing or the historic salt marsh. And we then developed a suite of criteria that would help inform the design of the project. The marsh would obviously have to have sufficient width and elevation to dissipate wave energy, to enhance sediment trapping and promote dissipation of the wind waves, and provide colonization of native salt marsh species. It would also have to be stable, and it would have to be able to dissipate that wind wave energy at the leading edge of the marsh, and it would also need to include a tidal channel network. And so we worked with a variety of different analog marshes within the eastern shoreline and looked at the different characteristics of those and applied that to the design of the salt marsh. So what's shown here on the top is a plan view of the concept. The black dashed line is the historic footprint of the 1870 marsh. So within that is the proposed restored marsh. The dots 1, 2, and 3 correspond with the cross section here. So here is the Humboldt Bay Trail South, and then leading down off of the former rail prism would be a high marsh ecotone. This would provide a really nice transition for upland species, transitioning down into brackish and tidal wetland species. The marsh is shown here, extending out about 120 feet and leading down to shingle gravel beach. The gravel beach would promote dissipation of the wind wave energy and help stabilize the sediments that would be placed back here, which could be done through terrestrial land-based equipment or through pumping of dredge spoils. The shoreline, the shingle beach rather, would help contain those sediments, and it could also be considered to be constructed in phases over time as sediment becomes available, either through dredging operations or through other regional projects. So this is a rendering that Hank showed earlier. The marsh would be compatible with a range of different adaptation strategies that Caltrans chooses to look at into the future. And so in terms of next steps, a project of this scope and scale has not been done on Humboldt Bay. We have to recognize that. A lot of the salt marsh restoration projects in Humboldt Bay and the Eel River estuary have always restored salt marsh behind the dike. This is restoring salt marsh in front of the dike. So with that inherently are going to be some constructability and permitting and regulatory considerations. And so this project or a similar project has actually been done in South San Francisco Bay, which is shown here in the bottom left, during construction and then post-construction photos. So a lot of lessons learned, and that can be applied or taken from that project to this project potentially into the future. We're also going to be looking at passive versus active sediment placement. Could the gravel shingle beach be constructed in advance? And if so, what would be the possibility of natural processes promoting accretion of the salt marsh landward of that beach. So we'll be working closely with Connor and Jeff Anderson and looking more closely at those different types of implementation opportunities. And then, of course, looking at beneficial reuse of dredge spoils. There are a number of regulatory considerations that this project is going to have to consider also as part of this next phase. The ecological trade-offs with converting mudflat to salt marsh, wetland fill and creation, and the balance of those two. And then what are the expectations for long-term monitoring and management? So an opportunity does exist here on the northern end of the project area for a demonstration project. This is an area where potentially these different concepts could be vetted out and could be considered then in terms of looking at scaling the project up over time and through a phased implementation approach. Thank you.